Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you to Heartland for having me out here today. Without a doubt, the Trump administration's recent proposal is a welcome victory for consumer choice, but also people who are just worried about the upfront costs of new cars and new trucks. It'd be nice if Congress demonstrated similar fortitude and recognized that these energy use mandates for vehicles, for dishwashers, for clocks on microwaves are all unnecessary and actually repealed these standards, but I think that's wishful thinking. I'd like to focus my talk on these three issues. One, the inability of the federal government and regulators to predict what's going to happen in energy markets and the problems with the regulations that stem from that. Secondly, the impact and the cost to consumers. And then I'll gloss over the third one, since Sterling did a wonderful job of covering that, and just the problems with the government paternalism when it comes to regulating energy use. I mean, these whole idea of energy use mandates and CAFE standards they're not just a relic of the past, but they're a systemic problem with the way that politicians and regulators and pundits and lobbyists all view energy markets. It's that there's this politically concocted problem, whether it's we're running out of oil or we need to introduce this new technology to create all of these jobs for my district, and then you get policies to support allegedly solving this politically concocted problem. I was just reading an article, this is a bit of an aside, I was just reading an article in the New York Times the other day, and it was called A New Era for Windmills. And it started out, it was something like very poetic, like a new era of windmills that Don Quixote could never tilt at, is ready to be cost competitive with fossil fuels, and they're ready today. And then I looked at the date of it, and I was 8 years old when that article came out. It was written in 1992. But from that article and from lobbyists convincing members of Congress that that's the wave of the future, we get a wind production tax credit, and we get a loan guarantee program, and we get an entire national laboratory at the Department of Energy geared toward commercializing renewable power. It's the same with CAFE standards. It was built on this notion of scarcity and that we're running out of oil. Just to show how difficult it is to predict where energy markets are going to go, I looked at this article from 538 from, I think it was written in 2015. They covered why it's so difficult to predict where oil prices are going to go. And it mentioned a Wall Street Journal article that asked the question in July of 2008 to more than 24 energy experts where they thought the price of a barrel of oil would be at the end of the year. And these are people who follow these trends most closely. And they had predictions as low as $70 a barrel, about a high of nearly $170 a barrel. Obviously, you can tell from where that chart is, but this was the actual price at the end of the year. Now, I bring this up because CAFE standards ultimately attempt to do the same thing. The regulators, when crafting these standards, when they're estimating the alleged consumer savings, are estimating where gas prices are going to go decades into the future. When I was looking at the Obama-era standards, I know they projected gas prices would be $3.74 in the year 2025, and I think it was like $4.25 in the year 2040. And they were using the Energy Information Administration, so it was more technical than this poll, the annual energy outlooks, and looking at the best available trends. But those trends can be wrong. Those prices could very well be accurate, but they could also be a lot lower. They could be a lot higher. But the reality is it's difficult to project where oil prices and gas prices are going to be 22 weeks from now, let alone 22 years. And so we should definitely take these consumer savings estimates when the federal government estimates them with a huge grain of salt. I think when concocting these policies, especially something like the Energy Policy Conservation Act of 1975, these staffers and members of Congress could have really used a good dose of Hayek. this standard, the CAFE standards, don't make sense now as we're awash in oil. We're in an era of oil abundance. But they didn't make sense back then either, because we have price signals to respond to markets. And producers will produce more oil, consumers will buy more fuel-efficient cars, they will seek alternative modes of transportation, investors will invest in alternative forms of technology and transportation fuel. The market will sort these things out. And so I try to bring this first quote by Hayek up every time I get a chance to talk about the government meddling in energy markets, because I think it demonstrates so well what politicians aim to do, but what they're not able to do. Now, we did a study at Heritage back in 2016. My colleague Salim Firth, who is now at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, who looked at the price trends of vehicles before the Obama-era CAFE standards and then after the Obama-era CAFE standards. And what you can see here is in the mid-90s to about 2009, when CAFE standards were relatively static, not completely static. I think for model year 2005 to 2010 for light trucks, there was a slight increase. The Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 required more stringent standards, but it wasn't until a few years later until the autos really started gearing up for that. But you can see the price trends of new vehicles at a time when CAFE standards were relatively static. And if you look at the quality adjusted average price, it's on a downward slope until these new regulations take place. In fact, if they had trended with furnishings and durable household equipment, which is one of the more similar things you can compare it to, those prices of vehicles would have been about 23% lower than they were in model years 2011 to model years 2016. And this isn't all that unsurprising. In fact, when these Obama-era standards were put in place, most economists were projecting cost increases of this magnitude. And so what Salim did was look at the average price compared to these trends and found that the average new car prices have risen $6,200 above these price trends. So it's a significant amount by any standard. Now, one could argue that maybe this is happening all over the world. And what Salim did was compare this to other countries, what was happening really around the world, because if the price of manufacturing a vehicle, if the inputs are increasing, it's, steel and aluminum are going up, then you're likely to see those price trends diverge in other countries. And that really wasn't the case. The only place where it was the case was in Canada, which had implemented similar stringent standards to the United States' CAFE standards. There were some price increases in France and Italy. I think France's price increases started going up relatively in 2012 and Italy's in 2013, but there was no systemic shift. And so you can see that while CAFE standards might not be the end-all be-all as a result of in causing these causing these car prices to increase, it without a doubt had an impact. And economists have measured this. Mark Jacobson is one of the major economists who's looked at fuel economy standards for a long time and attempted to calculate what that consumer loss was, because it isn't just the cost to consumers on the upfront cost, but those costs ultimately end up trickling down through the used car market as well. And so he found for each 1 mile per gallon increase in CAFE standards after 5 years is a $20 billion loss in terms of consumer surplus that after a while, as it makes its way through the used car market, disproportionately impacts low-income households. Now, I love this quote, too. As much as I love the Hayek quote, I love the quote from Stephen Chu, our former Secretary of Energy. He said this in relation to energy use and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that the American public act like teenagers when it comes to energy consumption. And at the time, DOE tried to walk that back and say that's not really what he meant. But if you look at what the EPA administrator, Lisa Jackson, said around the same time, she said something very similar, and that was, we're going to show you how to be energy efficient, and we're going to lead the way in showing you why you need to be energy efficient. And it just speaks, and obviously this wasn't just the Obama administration. I mean, these standards date back for 4 or 5 decades now, but it was this whole notion that consumers are irresponsible when it comes to energy consumption, that they don't understand why they should be making the choices they are, so we're going to make the choices for them. And I look all around. Every time I'm in the supermarket and I see that the lights in the freezer section are dim, and once you pull the door open, they light up. It's because they're trying to save energy. The parking garage where I live has automatic timers to save energy. I mean, producers and consumers understand how to respond to price signals that are out there, and consumers certainly do when purchasing vehicles. And I think this really complements what Sterling was getting at too, is all of the valuable attributes that come from purchasing a vehicle. And this MIT study demonstrates why people prefer the choices that they do. They found that if we held weight, horsepower, and torque at constant 1980 levels, fuel efficiency would have increased 60%. That sounds great. Why didn't it increase at 60%? Because people value weight, horsepower, and torque more. And the producers were responding to what consumers actually want. So yes, fuel efficiency is a valuable attribute, but there are so many more valuable attributes that are out there. Why would you want to take that away from the consumer and force autos to make cars that people simply don't want to buy? Lastly, I will just end on the fact that who does this help? And I love this title quote from a Council on Foreign Relations op-ed, that we need CAFE standards to protect innovation from low oil prices. I mean, that just says everything right there as to why they need these standards. And the second point, a company like Tesla, and they're not the only one obviously, but the ability to design a regulatory scheme and to make money off it. You see it with the renewable identification numbers and the renewable fuel standard. You see it with the zero emissions credits and the credits that are available through meeting the CAFE standards, is that you can have this policy, which is similar to most energy policies in the United States, where you're concentrating benefits to certain select industries and dispersing the costs amongst us. And the costs come in a lot of different forms, whether it's higher prices for vehicles, lost consumer choice, preferences being overridden by the federal government. All of these are costs to consumers that we need to take into consideration, and ultimately why we need to scrap these policies in total. I think I'm finished now. I'll leave a little more time so we have for questions and answers. Thank you.